December 16, 1944, 5:30 in the morning, the Ardennes forest, Belgium. The world was white and silent. Snow fell in thick curtains across the ancient forests of the Ardennes, blanketing pine trees that had stood for centuries, muffling sound, erasing roads, turning foxholes into shallow graves lined with frost. The temperature hovered near 15 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to freeze rifle mechanisms, cold enough to turn breath into ice crystals that hung in the air like tiny daggers. In the dim pre-dawn darkness, American soldiers of the 99th Infantry Division huddled in their positions along an 85-mile front, their hands shoved deep into pockets, their feet wrapped in whatever scraps of cloth they could find to ward off trench foot. They had been told this sector was quiet, a rest area, a place where green troops could acclimate to combat without facing the full fury of the Wehrmacht. Some men wrote letters home by candlelight. Others heated tins of rations over small fires, watching the flames flicker in the wind. A few tried to sleep, curled into balls beneath thin wool blankets that did little against the creeping cold. The forest seemed peaceful, almost serene, as if the war had forgotten this corner of Europe. Then the earth began to scream. At precisely 5:30, the German artillery opened fire. Thousands of guns, Nebelwerfers, 88 mm cannons, heavy mortars erupted in a coordinated barrage that shook the frozen ground and split the morning air with thunder. Shells fell like iron rain, tearing through trees, collapsing dugouts, sending geysers of dirt and snow skyward. The sound was not just loud. It was physical, a pressure wave that crushed eardrums and rattled teeth. Men were thrown from their positions, blinded by dirt and smoke, deafened by the roar. Trees splintered and fell, their trunks shredded by shrapnel. The snow turned black with smoke, red with blood, and through the smoke and fire, advancing across the white fields like wolves, came the soldiers of the 6th Panzer Army. They moved in columns, thousands strong, supported by Tiger tanks whose engines growled like distant thunder. They wore winter camouflage smocks over their uniforms, white against white, nearly invisible until they were almost upon the American lines. Their faces were hard, confident. They had been told this would be easy, that the Americans were soft, unprepared, demoralized after months of grinding combat through France. That winter, the German weapon would do half the work for them. That the Ardennes, with its narrow roads and thick forests, would trap the American mechanized units and turn their strength into weakness. They believed winter was their ally, their secret weapon, their salvation. They were about to learn otherwise. Historical context: the gamble in the snow. To understand what happened in the Ardennes, one must first understand desperation. By December 1944, Nazi Germany was dying. The Third Reich, which had once stretched from the Atlantic to the gates of Moscow, from Norway to North Africa, was collapsing inward like a star consuming itself. In the east, the Soviet Red Army had shattered Army Group Center and stood on the borders of East Prussia, poised to invade the German homeland. In the south, Italy had fallen, and Allied armies threatened the Alpine passes. In the west, American, British, and Canadian forces had liberated France and Belgium, and now pressed against the German frontier, preparing for the final assault across the Rhine. Adolf Hitler knew the war was lost, but he refused to accept it. In November 1944, Hitler summoned his top generals to the Wolfsschlacht, the Wolf's Gorge, his field headquarters in the forests of eastern Germany. There, surrounded by maps and trembling aides, the Führer unveiled his plan for one last great offensive, a massive counterattack that would split the Allied armies in two, recapture the vital port of Antwerp, and force the Western powers to sue for peace. He called it Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine, but history would know it by another name, the Battle of the Bulge. The plan was audacious to the point of fantasy. 25 divisions, more than 200 men, 400 tanks, 900 artillery pieces, would smash through the weakly defended Ardennes sector, cross the Meuse River, and drive northwest to Antwerp, trapping 4 Allied armies in a pocket and destroying them. The attack would be launched in winter, when low clouds and snowstorms would ground Allied aircraft and neutralize American air superiority. The Ardennes, with its rugged terrain and limited road network, would channel American reinforcements into killing zones. And the German soldiers, veterans of the Eastern Front who had endured the frozen hell of Russia, would be fighting in conditions they understood, while the Americans, accustomed to material superiority and warm barracks, would wilt in the cold. Hitler's generals were horrified. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the elderly commander of the Western Front, called the plan a stab in the dark. General Alfred Jodl warned that the Wehrmacht lacked the fuel, ammunition, and reserves for such an operation. But Hitler was beyond reason. He believed in willpower, in destiny, in the mythic power of German arms. And he believed, with absolute conviction, that winter would save them. Germany had always trusted winter. In 1812, winter had destroyed Napoleon's Grand Armée in Russia, turning 500,000 French soldiers into frozen corpses. In 1941, winter had stopped the Wehrmacht at the gates of Moscow, freezing tank engines and turning German soldiers into brittle statues. The German High Command had studied these campaigns. They knew that winter was a force multiplier, a weapon that could break armies and shatter morale. They knew that American soldiers, raised on abundance and comfort, would not be able to endure the hardship. They knew that cold was a German advantage. They were wrong, because the Americans who would fight in the Ardennes were not the soft, materialistic boys of Nazi propaganda. They were farmers from Iowa who had worked 60-hour days in sub-zero temperatures. They were lumberjacks from Minnesota who had spent winters in the North Woods. They were factory workers from Detroit who had survived the Depression, hunters from Montana who knew how to track and kill in snow, sons of immigrants who had crossed the Atlantic with nothing and built lives from scratch. They were men who understood hardship, who had been raised in a country where survival meant adaptation, where comfort was earned, not given. And they were about to prove that winter did not belong to Germany alone. The illusion, what the Germans expected the German soldiers who advanced into the Ardennes on that frozen December morning, carried with them a set of assumptions, half-truths, and propaganda, fed fantasies about their enemy. They had been told repeatedly that the Americans were weak. In training camps and barracks from Cologne to Dresden, Wehrmacht officers lectured their men on the decadence of American society. They showed films of fat, lazy Americans lounging in movie theaters, gorging themselves on hamburgers, wasting resources on trivial luxuries. They read excerpts from Mein Kampf, where Hitler described America as a mongrel nation, corrupted by Jewish influence, a country without true culture or fighting spirit. They cited examples from North Africa and Sicily, where American units had sometimes faltered or retreated under German counterattacks. They pointed to the lavish supply system of the U.S. Army, the hot meals, the dry socks, the cigarettes and candy, as evidence of a force that could not function without comfort. The Americans fight with machines, not courage, the officers said. They rely on their planes and tanks because they lack the heart to face us man to man. This belief was deeply ingrained in German military culture. The Wehrmacht prided itself on toughness, on the ability to endure suffering, to march 40 kilometers in a day on empty stomachs, to fight without rest, to turn desperation into aggression. German soldiers were taught to see hardship as a crucible, a test of worthiness. Head hardness was the highest virtue. To suffer was to be strong. To endure cold, hunger, exhaustion was to be a true soldier. And so, when the attack was launched, the Germans expected the Americans to break. They expected the cold to shatter American morale within hours. They expected the green troops of the 99th and 106th Infantry Divisions to panic and run at the first sign of heavy fire. They expected the American command structure to collapse into confusion, unable to adapt to the speed and brutality of the assault. They expected the narrow roads of the Ardennes to become clogged with abandoned vehicles, with fleeing soldiers, with the wreckage of an army that had never truly understood war. In the first hours of the attack, it seemed their expectations might be correct. German camp, Gruppen battle groups, punched through American lines in a dozen places. Entire battalions were surrounded and forced to surrender. Communications broke down. Supply lines were cut. In the village of Schnee-Eifel, 2 entire regiments of the 106th Infantry Division were trapped on a ridgeline, encircled by panzer units, with no hope of relief. By nightfall on December 16, the German advance had penetrated 15 miles into Allied territory in some sectors. Prisoners were marched back toward Germany in long, stumbling columns. Villages that had been liberated weeks earlier were recaptured. The American front was collapsing, but something was wrong. Everywhere the Germans advanced, they encountered resistance that should not have existed. At crossroads villages, small groups of American soldiers, engineers, clerks, cooks, artillerymen, formed improvised strongpoints and held out for hours, sometimes days, against vastly superior forces. At St. Vith, a critical road junction, a mixed force of American infantry and armor refused to retreat, buying time for reinforcements to move south. At Bastogne, another vital crossroads, the 101st Airborne Division dug in and prepared to defend the town to the last man. And instead of fleeing from the cold, the Americans adapted to it. They stripped German corpses for winter gear, taking wool scarves and fur-lined gloves. They stuffed newspapers into their boots for insulation. They melted snow for water and shared body heat in foxholes. They learned to fire their rifles in short bursts to prevent the mechanisms from freezing. They kept moving, kept fighting, kept killing, even as the temperature dropped and the snow piled higher. The Germans had expected winter to be their weapon. Instead, it became the crucible in which American resolve was forged. The reality, frozen ground, burning will December 19, 1944, near the village of Elsenborn Ridge, Belgium. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Craig, commander of the 2nd Battalion, 38th Infantry Regiment, stood in a shallow trench carved into the frozen hillside and watched the German tanks come. There were 12 of them marked Roman 4 Panzers, their turrets swiveling, their guns searching for targets. Behind them came infantry, clad figures moving in loose formations across the open ground. The morning was clear, bitterly cold, the kind of cold that made metal burn skin on contact. Craig's breath formed clouds in front of his face. His hands, even inside thick gloves, ached with the chill. Around him, his men crouched behind makeshift barricades of logs and frozen earth, their rifles ready, their faces grim. They had been holding this position for 3 days. The Elsenborn Ridge was a low, wooded hill that overlooked the road network leading west toward Liege and Antwerp. If the Germans could take the ridge, they could push their tanks through the gap and reach the Meuse River in days. But if the Americans could hold it, the entire northern shoulder of the German offensive would stall. Eisenhower had called Elsenborn the key to the north. Craig understood what that meant. His battalion had to hold, or thousands would die. The Germans had attacked twice already, and twice they had been driven back with heavy losses. But they were coming again, and this time they had armor. Craig raised his binoculars and studied the advancing tanks. They moved slowly, cautiously, their treads crunching over the snow-covered ground. Behind them, the infantry followed in rushes, taking cover behind trees and rocks. He could see their breath, white puffs in the cold air. He could see the determination on their faces. These were not green troops or rear echelon soldiers. These were veterans, men who had fought across Europe, who had survived Normandy and Falaise and the retreat through France. They believed they could break the American line, hold fire, Craig said quietly, his voice carried down the trench. Wait for my signal. The Americans waited. The cold pressed down on them like a weight. Some men shivered uncontrollably, their bodies fighting hypothermia. Others had stopped shivering, which was worse, a sign that their core temperatures were dropping to dangerous levels. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes, turning flesh black and numb. Men urinated on their hands to warm them, a trick learned from veterans of the Eastern Front. The wind cut through every layer of clothing, through wool and canvas and leather, finding skin and stealing heat. But they held. The tanks came closer, 300 yards, 200. Craig could see the details now, the scraped paint on the hulls, the mud caked on the treads, the hatches sealed against the cold. The lead tank's gun traversed, searching. Behind Craig, a young soldier named Private First Class Jimi Hendrix whispered a prayer, his hands gripping his rifle so tightly the knuckles turned white. Now, Craig said, the ridge exploded. Bazookas fired from concealed positions, their rockets streaking across the frozen air and slamming into the panzers. One tank erupted in flames, its ammunition cooking off, sending the turret spinning into the sky. Another stopped dead, smoke pouring from its engine compartment. Machine guns opened up, raking the infantry, cutting down men as they tried to scatter. Artillery, registered on the approach routes, began to fall, walking backward toward the German lines, each explosion sending up fountains of snow and dirt. The Germans faltered. The infantry went to ground, pinned down by the withering fire. The remaining tanks tried to maneuver, but the frozen ground betrayed them. One slid sideways into a ditch. Another threw a tread trying to reverse. American riflemen poured fire into the infantry, aiming carefully, conserving ammunition, each shot deliberate. Men who had been farm boys 6 months ago now killed with the precision of veterans. The German attack broke. The surviving tanks retreated, engines screaming, leaving 2 of their number burning on the slope. The infantry pulled back in disorder, dragging their wounded, leaving their dead. Within 15 minutes, the field was empty except for corpses and wreckage. Craig lowered his binoculars and exhaled slowly. His hands were shaking from cold or adrenaline. He couldn't tell. "They'll come again," someone said. "Let them," Craig replied. "We'll be here." And they were. For 6 days, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions held the Elsenborn Ridge against everything the 6th Panzer Army could throw at them. They fought in temperatures that dropped to 0 degrees Fahrenheit. They fought through blizzards that reduced visibility to a few feet. They fought without hot food, without dry clothes, without rest. They fought with frozen rifles that jammed, with frostbitten hands that could barely pull triggers, with feet so numb they could no longer feel the ground. And they won. By December 22, the German offensive in the north had stalled completely. The 6th Panzer Army, which had been assigned the main effort of the attack, was stopped cold. Thousands of German soldiers lay frozen in the snow, their bodies abandoned as the Wehrmacht fell back. The road to Antwerp was closed, the northern shoulder held. The Germans had expected winter to save them. Instead, it revealed a truth they had not foreseen. Hardship does not belong to any one nation. Cold does not discriminate. And the will to fight, the raw, stubborn refusal to break, is not a product of ideology or propaganda, but of something deeper, something the Americans carried within them like a flame that no winter could extinguish. Historical evidence. The bitter mathematics of cold, the Battle of the Bulge, was not decided by grand strategy or technological superiority. It was decided by men in foxholes, by small unit actions fought in conditions that should have been unsurvivable. The casualty figures from the Ardennes are staggering. Between December 16, 1944, and January 25, 1945, a span of 40 days, the United States Army suffered approximately 89,000 casualties, 19,000 killed, 47,500 wounded, and 23,000 captured or missing. The 101st Airborne Division, which held Bastogne, lost nearly half its strength. The 99th Infantry Division, which held Elsenborn Ridge, suffered 60% casualties in some battalions. Entire companies were reduced to platoon strength. Platoons became squads. Squads became handfuls of exhausted, frozen men who kept fighting because there was nothing else to do. But the German losses were catastrophic. The Wehrmacht committed more than 410,000 men to the offensive. By the end of January, it had lost over 100,000 of them, killed, wounded, or captured. More than 800 tanks and assault guns were destroyed or abandoned. Hundreds of artillery pieces were left behind as the Germans retreated. The Luftwaffe, which had scraped together 500 aircraft for the operation, lost over 1,000 planes in the first 2 weeks, many of them destroyed on the ground by American fighter bombers. Once weather cleared, the statistics on cold weather injuries are particularly revealing. U.S. Army medical records show that during the Battle of the Bulge, approximately 15,000 American soldiers were evacuated for frostbite and trench foot. This number, while significant, is far lower than German projections. Wehrmacht intelligence had estimated that American cold weather casualties would exceed 40,000 within the first week of the offensive, assuming that American troops lacked the training and equipment to survive. They were wrong. American soldiers adapted quickly using improvised methods, stuffing newspapers in boots, wrapping rifles in cloth, sleeping in shifts to share body heat. That reduced the severity of cold injuries. German cold weather casualties, by contrast, were devastating. Estimates suggest that over 30,000 German soldiers were rendered non-combat effective due to frostbite, hypothermia, and related conditions. Many had been transferred from the Eastern Front and were already suffering from chronic cold exposure. Others wore inadequate uniforms. The Wehrmacht's winter gear was designed for defensive operations in Russia, not for offensive combat in the West, and supplies were insufficient. Entire units reported losing 20–30% of their strength to cold before ever engaging the enemy. The psychological impact was equally important. American after-action reports from the period reveal a consistent pattern. German prisoners captured during the offensive expressed shock at American resilience. A captured lieutenant from the 12th SS Panzer Division, interrogated on December 23, stated, "We were told you would run as soon as the weather turned bad. We were told you could not fight without your comforts. We were wrong." Another prisoner, a sergeant from the 277th Volksgrenadier Division, told his interrogators, "Your men do not stop. We shoot and they come. We freeze and they freeze with us. We thought winter was ours, but it belongs to no one." These were not isolated statements. They reflected a broader collapse in German morale, a realization that the fundamental assumption underlying the offensive, that Americans were soft, was false. But there was more to it than toughness. Symbolism. The chocolate bear in the chaos of the Ardennes, amid the snow and blood and smoke, there emerged a symbol, small, mundane, yet loaded with meaning that transcended its physical form. The Dirachen chocolate bar. Every American soldier in the European theater carried one. It was standard issue, packed in a brown wrapper, stamped with U.S. Army. The bar itself was dense, almost brick-like, formulated to withstand extreme temperatures without melting. It tasted terrible, waxy, bitter, more fuel than food, but it contained 600 calories and could keep a man moving for hours. The instructions printed on the wrapper were simple: to be eaten only in emergency, will sustain life. For the soldiers in the Ardennes, it became more than rations. It became proof that someone, somewhere, had thought ahead, that an entire nation's industrial capacity had been bent toward the task of keeping them alive, that even here, in this frozen hell, they were not forgotten. When a soldier in a foxhole unwrapped a D-ration and chewed through the tough chocolate, he was reminded that behind him stood factories, supply chains, ships, trains, warehouses, a vast logistical machine dedicated to his survival. He was reminded that he was not alone. German soldiers noticed. Reports from Wehrmacht intelligence officers in December 1944 mention the D-ration repeatedly. One report, filed by a Hauptmann captain in the 2nd Panzer Division, describes searching American positions after an engagement and finding crates of food, blankets, medical supplies more in one foxhole than our entire company has received in a month. Another report notes, the Americans leave behind chocolate, cigarettes, canned meat. Our men are starving, yet they discard food. This is not an army. This is a state that wages war. It was true. The United States, by 1944, had become the world's greatest logistical power. American factories produced more than 300 aircraft, 88 tanks, 4 million trucks, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition during the war. The U.S. Merchant Marine operated more than 50 cargo ships, delivering millions of tons of supplies to Europe every month. The Red Ball Express, A network of truck convoys moved 1,500 tons of supplies daily across France. Even in the midst of the Ardennes offensive, with roads cut and supply lines threatened, American quartermasters managed to deliver hot food, ammunition, and winter clothing to front-line units. This was not decadence, it was doctrine. The American military understood something fundamental. Soldiers fight better when they are fed, clothed, and cared for. This was not weakness, it was strength. It was the recognition that logistics is strategy, that supply is survival, that a nation's industrial power is the foundation of its military power. The Germans called it materialism. The Americans called it winning. And in the frozen foxholes of the Ardennes, that chocolate bar, bitter and dense and wrapped in brown paper, became a symbol of abundance, of a nation that could afford to care for its sons even in the worst conditions imaginable. It whispered a simple truth: you are not expendable, you matter, hold on. The Germans had no equivalent. Wehrmacht soldiers in the Ardennes subsisted on dwindling rations of black bread, ersatz sausage, and thin soup. Many units went days without hot food. Supply convoys were destroyed by Allied aircraft. Fuel shortages stranded tanks and trucks. Horses, still the primary means of hauling artillery in the German army, died by the thousands, frozen or starved, their carcasses left to rot in the snow. Soldiers scavenged American positions for food, sometimes risking their lives for a single can of Spam or a pack of cigarettes. The contrast was stark and demoralizing. A German corporal, captured near Bastogne on December 27, told his interrogators, "We fight for ideals, but you fight with full stomachs. In the end, the stomach wins." It was a bitter acknowledgment, but it reflected a truth that German propaganda could not obscure. Abundance was power. The ability to feed an army, to clothe it, to supply it with everything it needed to fight. This was not a luxury. It was a weapon, and it was a weapon the Germans could not match. By late December, as the German offensive ground to a halt, American soldiers began to leave chocolate bars in abandoned positions, deliberate, symbolic gestures. They placed them on tree stumps, on walls, on the bodies of dead Germans, as a message: we have so much, we can afford to leave it behind. It was psychological warfare of the most subtle kind, and it worked. Transformation. The fire in the snow, December 22, 1944. Bastogne, Belgium. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne Division, stood in the cellar of a bombed-out barracks in the center of Bastogne and read the German surrender ultimatum. One more time. The message had been delivered that morning by a German major under a flag of truce. It was typed on crisp paper, formal and polite, and it demanded the immediate surrender of the American garrison. The Germans pointed out that Bastogne was surrounded, that no relief was coming, that continued resistance was pointless and would result in the annihilation of the town and everyone in it. They gave the Americans 2 hours to respond. McAuliffe read the message, folded it carefully, and said one word: nuts. His staff laughed, nervous, exhausted laughter, but laughter nonetheless. Someone suggested they should send a more formal reply. McAuliffe shook his head. "That's my answer," he said. "Send it." And so they did. The German emissaries, confused by the American slang, had to ask for clarification. A lieutenant colonel explained it means essentially go to hell. The Germans departed in silence. The response became legend, but the real significance of Bastogne was not a single witty reply. It was what the defense of that town represented, the transformation of the American soldier from a material, dependent force into a hardened, self-reliant fighting machine that could endure anything. Bastogne was hell. The town, a small market center of 300-500 people, sat at the junction of 7 roads, making it a critical transportation hub. When the German offensive began, the 101st Airborne Division, still recovering from Operation Market Garden, was rushed south in trucks and ordered to hold Bastogne at all costs. They arrived on December 18, just hours before German panzer columns encircled the town. Within 24 hours, Bastogne was completely cut off. For the next week, the defenders fought in conditions that defied belief. The weather was brutal. Temperatures plunged below zero. Snow fell continuously, piling into drifts that buried vehicles and obscured trenches. Low clouds prevented aerial resupply for days. Food ran out. Ammunition dwindled to a few rounds per rifle. Medical supplies were exhausted. Surgeons operated without anesthesia, amputating frozen limbs by candlelight. Men slept standing up in foxholes because lying down meant freezing to death. Frostbite claimed hundreds. Soldiers urinated on their hands to warm them, then wrapped the hands in rags and kept firing. And still they held. German attacks came from every direction. Infantry supported by tanks, Sturmgeschütz assault guns, waves of Volksgrenade, ears screaming Sieg Heil as they charged across open ground. American paratroopers, outnumbered and outgunned, met each attack with rifle fire, grenades, improvised explosives. They fought house to house, street to street, tree to tree. They turned every stone wall into a fortress, every cellar into a strongpoint. They killed Germans by the hundreds, stacking bodies in frozen heaps. On December 23, the weather cleared. American C-47 transport planes appeared over Bastogne, braving German anti-aircraft fire to drop supplies by parachute. Bundles of ammunition, food, medical supplies, winter clothing, everything the garrison needed drifted down from the sky like manna. Soldiers cheered, weeping openly. Bombers followed, strafing German positions, bombing supply columns, turning the roads around Bastogne into graveyards of burning vehicles. On December 26, elements of the 4th Armored Division broke through the German encirclement and reached Bastogne. The siege was over. The defense of Bastogne became a turning point, not just tactically, but psychologically. It demonstrated that American soldiers could not be broken, that they would fight even when surrounded, outnumbered, and outgunned, that they would endure cold and hunger and fear and still refuse to surrender. It transformed the narrative of the Ardennes from a German near victory into an American triumph of will. But the transformation was not limited to Bastogne. Across the Ardennes, in 1,000 small actions, American soldiers learned to fight in winter. They learned to move silently through snow, to camouflage positions with white sheets, to break ice on streams to get water, to keep their weapons clean in conditions that turned oil into sludge. They learned to read the forest, to use terrain, to trust their instincts. They learned that hardship did not weaken them, it revealed them. The German belief that winter was their weapon had been shattered. Winter belonged to no one. It was a crucible, and the Americans emerged from it, forged into something harder, something the Germans had not anticipated. They emerged as soldiers who understood that survival was not about comfort or material superiority. It was about will, about the refusal to quit, about the decision to keep moving forward even when every rational thought said to stop. A sergeant in the 101st Airborne, interviewed after the battle, put it simply, "They thought the cold would break us, but cold is just weather. You can't break weather. You just learn to live in it." That was the transformation, not a change in tactics or equipment, but a change in understanding. The Americans had learned that they could endure. And once they learned that, the outcome of the battle and the war was no longer in doubt. Epilogue: the fire that winter could not kill by January 25, 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was over. The German offensive, which had begun with such fury and hope, had collapsed completely. The Wehrmacht retreated eastward, abandoning equipment, leaving thousands of dead in the snow. The bulge in the Allied lines, the salient that gave the battle its name, was erased. The road to Germany lay open. But the cost had been staggering. The Ardennes became the deadliest battle in American military history. Nearly 20,000 American soldiers were killed, more than in any other single engagement of the war. Entire towns were reduced to rubble. The forests were scarred with shell craters and burned-out tanks. The snow, which had fallen so beautifully in mid-December, was stained with blood and oil and ash. Yet something had been proven in that frozen hell, something that would echo far beyond the Ardennes. The Germans had believed that winter would save them, that cold and hardship would break the Americans, that material superiority meant nothing in the face of nature's brutality. They had believed that ideology, their vaunted head, their cult of suffering made them superior. They had believed that democratic societies, with their emphasis on individual comfort and prosperity, could not produce soldiers willing to endure. They were wrong on every count. The Americans who fought in the Ardennes proved that abundance and resilience are not opposites, they are complements. A nation that can feed its soldiers, that can supply them, that can care for them, is not weak, it is powerful. And when those soldiers are tested, when they are pushed to the edge of human endurance, they do not break. They adapt. They endure. They win. The chocolate bar, the hot meal, the dry socks, these were not signs of softness. They were signs of a society that valued its people, that understood that human beings fight better when they are treated as individuals, not as expendable cogs in a machine. The American way of war was not about glorifying suffering. It was about minimizing it, using technology and logistics and organization to give soldiers every advantage. But when those advantages were stripped away, when the soldiers were left alone in frozen foxholes with nothing but their weapons and their will, they proved that they could fight as hard as anyone. Harder, perhaps, because they were not fighting for an ideology that demanded sacrifice. They were fighting for something deeper, for each other, for home, for the belief that ordinary people deserve to live free and prosperous lives. That belief, more than any weapon or doctrine, was what carried them through the winter. A lieutenant in the 99th Infantry Division, riding home in late January, captured it perfectly. We were cold, hungry, scared. We thought we might die, but we didn't run. We didn't quit. We held because we knew that someone somewhere was counting on us, and because we knew that if we could survive this, we could survive anything. The Germans thought winter was their weapon. They were wrong. Winter doesn't belong to anyone. It just is, and we learned to be stronger than it. That was the truth the Germans had failed to understand. Winter does not choose sides. Cold does not care about ideology. Nature is indifferent to human struggles, but human beings are not indifferent to each other. And a society built on the principle that every person matters, that abundance should be shared, that comfort is not shameful, but earned. Such a society produces soldiers who fight not just to win, but to protect what they have built. The Germans had glorified hardship, had turned suffering into a virtue, had believed that cruelty made them strong. But in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, they discovered that strength does not come from suffering. It comes from the refusal to let suffering define you. It comes from the knowledge that you are part of something larger, something worth preserving, something worth fighting for even when the world is white and cold and silent. The Americans fought through the blizzard not because they were harder than the Germans, but because they carried within them a fire that winter could not kill, the fire of freedom, of abundance, of the belief that life should be lived, not merely endured. And in the end, that fire was enough.